Okay, so basically, everyone, what I'm going to do while I'm loading this up, because I do try to be a reasonable multitasker, what I'm going to be doing today is going through a little bit about what this whole open government thing actually means in practice, you know, beyond the sort of fluffy higher speak. What is it? Woo! What does it all actually mean? Well, what year are we in? 2011. Where's my talk? Oh my god, this is really irritating right now. Okay, there we go, 2011 OSDC. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a little bit about what open government kind of is supposed to be from a technical and practical perspective. I'll be giving you a couple of case studies. I'll be talking a little bit about procurement and the part that procurement plays in, and what part, I guess, free and open source software plays in the open government agenda. I'll just try to give you a bit more of a technical understanding of what's going on. Just so you know, my background in this specific area, when I first came to work for the Senator, she wanted me to work for her to do technology policy. And she had known me through my work in the open source community, which is cool. And so she hired me with that understanding that that's what I'd be sort of bringing to the party. And it's been really great, actually. All of you would have seen her speak this morning, and it has been actually really good to learn a little bit about how government actually works, how important the role that government, the relationship that government has to technology is in the broader IT industry, for our community, for geeks everywhere. Like it's sort of hard until you see it to really understand the part that it plays. I mean, government is the biggest procurer of technology. It spends the most amount of money, and therefore it ends up defining a lot of the landscape, whether we like it or not. So engaging with and trying to get good policy from government is kind of important. So, open government, what does it all mean, really? Okay, so most people basically think of government as basically just the garbage collector. They sort of see their relationship with government is very much defined through the things that affect them in their everyday life. So you see, you know, your services, you see sort of the health, you see there's a lot of assumptions about bureaucrats, about politicians, about people that work for politicians, and I bear the brunt of those most days, which is hilarious. And I always say to these people who love to troll me, I've dealt with the open source community. You got nothing on the trolls I've dealt with. So, in a way, I have been trained well, and I thank you all. But it has actually been very good training, because it really taught me my time in the open source community. And keeping in mind that I've never been a developer, my background's sysadmin, but I've sort of always tried to do what I do well, which is strangely talking and cheerleading. So those are kind of the roles I've played, whether it be Linux Australia or Software Freedom International or the various different organisations I've been involved in. And I've sort of realised that there's a lot of the same skills that are required. So if you have a lot of people who care passionately about something, who all manage to find the tiniest differences to disagree on and hate each other for, but if you can actually pull them in and say, yeah, but what are the things you have in common, you actually have a huge power to do great things. And we see that with the software we develop, with the ethos that we develop, with the amazing successes we have. Anyway, back to garbage. So a lot of people, their relationship to garbage, to government, is defined. It's very much defined through what they see practically, and so most people just don't see what happens in government, and they think that government is kind of this useless thing and all the rest of it. And I, particularly in a country like Australia, where even the most right wing of us would be defined as a raging, you know, socialist in the US, for instance, because you know we expect to have free healthcare, we expect to have cheap and available public education, or free public education and public transport and all these kinds of things. Government actually plays a really, really important role. And whenever people say, oh, well, all politicians are this or that, it's like, well, yeah, but unless we get different people into politics, then that's going to continue to be the status quo. So what are you doing about it? So I guess for me, I've always seen, and particularly since coming into this role, much more so, I see government as a toolkit for us, as a population, as the people. It doesn't always do what we want it to do. In fact, sometimes it seems like it never does what we want it to do. But there are so many ways to engage with, to hold government to account in ways, you know, that were never available before. And I mean, you've got to pay credit to great projects like Open Australia, which takes a whole bunch of data, makes it more available and accessible and, you know, subscribable, and makes it easier for us as normal people to actually see what's going on and to then hold our representatives to account with what they're actually doing in government. it's kind of a very exciting time where the lines between government and citizen has massively blurred. And a lot of people seem to forget that the enormous number of people that work in various different levels of government are also citizens too. And this is a whole other shift that we're going through where, I mean, I am very atypical of a government policy advisor, of a political policy advisor, in that I actually have a public face. I have a public voice. I tend to make my perspectives known, and they don't always align with, the people that I work for. And that's very, very new. That's a very unusual thing. But we're getting to the point where that's okay. Because I'm a citizen as well, why shouldn't I have the right to have my perspective as well as, be able to do my job? So we're in a massive area of flux at the moment. It's all because of the internet, and it's all not just because of the availability of the internet, which we've had for a long time, but it's because of A, the mainstream availability of the internet, and B, how the internet is starting to change the perspectives of our society right throughout the world. When you are a actual online user, not just someone who just, uses the internet, but when you become, a person who is an internet person, you have certain expectations. You expect to be able to get access to whatever you want. You expect to be able to talk to whoever you want. You expect that your perspective should be heard and respected. And that's changing everything, because people are no longer just expecting the elite to be the ones to participate in policy development or discussions, but everyone wants to be able to have a piece of it, and that's good. So I think that we're getting into very exciting times. Good quote by Tim O'Reilly, there's a clear vision from the top, not only in the US and the UK, but in many other countries, that now is the time for government to reinvent itself, to take the old idea of government for the people, by the people, and of the people to a whole new level. I think that's very, very true. We're starting to see new ways that government can be held to account, can be transparent, new ways people, individuals can self-coordinate into massive movements, as we've seen many examples of, sometimes to great effect, sometimes not so much, but there's always the potential there. People can actually start to cross-check facts, so the official statement that comes out, well, okay, let's check that with what someone who lives on the ground is saying. Did any of you read the Salem Pax blog during Iraq? Yeah, one, okay. Salem Pax was the pseudonym for a... Yes, pseudonym, sorry, I just got my words mixed up. So the other thing is that my slides are nowhere near as cool as they should be, because I've spent the last 2 weeks really sick and I'm still in a lot of pain. So if I go a little bit off the bender, just let me know. Salem Pax was a fantastic pseudonym blog that was run during the invasion of Iraq when it first started. And it's just this, this dude, he's an architect, he's gay, he lived in the center of Iraq, and he'd be blogging, he'd be like, oh, there's tanks coming down the street. What's going on? Yeah, and it was fascinating because you actually saw the perspective of a person who's just like us on the ground. So rather than this, picture of, oh, look, we're liberating these poor people and rah, 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 you actually got the perspectives of a person. And I think that's really powerful because it's changing how governments can do things, how the media can do things. I mean, when you can actually talk directly to people, and this is a big lesson governments are starting to learn, and I'll get to a good example of that in a minute, but you can talk directly to people now. You don't have to go through the tiny, limited aperture that is the media. But so you can cross-check facts. You can actually engage in the process of what government does. And I mean, to be fair, even though we all want government to always be more open than it is, the democracy we have here and the systems we have here are actually one of the best in the world. We actually are quite open, but now we can take it to this whole next level. Anyway, so Gov 2.0. Web 2.0, Gov 2.0, they're all really stupid terms, right? We all know that as technical people, but... I'm
waiting for 2.1.
Well, the funny thing is, all the conferences that are now doing the Gov 3.0 conferences, and I'm like, oh, come on! And basically, what they are implying by that is semantic web. And it's like, why don't you just build that into your Gov 2.0 strategy? Why wait to the next version? Anyway, it's really quite silly. But there is a really strong community in Australia around this space, and a really good technical community, hacker, developer, implementer, user experience community in Australia around this stuff. And amazing, well, actually not amazingly, there's a lot of crossover with our community, I guess, and a lot of lessons drawn from there. But there are still a lot of people, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, I would highly recommend actually getting involved in this community a little bit. There's Gov camps running around the country. In fact, there's one in Sydney this weekend, which I'm going up to, and I think they're going to start running, and Gov camp is just a bar camp, looking at, the problems of government, making government more open and all that kind of stuff. Gov Hack was a project. And believe it or not, that was a government-funded run project, GovHack, right? It was fantastic. And what they did was, that was run a couple of years ago, and they opened up a whole bunch of data sets and then said, okay, people have got 24 hours to do cool stuff. We have some of the people that were hacking there here today. But one of the cool, go away, Firefox. But one of the cool things about it was that it, for a lot of senior people in government, the idea of public engagement, you know, it sounds fine. But they don't really genuinely think that they're going to get a lot of value by actually engaging publicly. They're like, oh, you know, this is what we're going to do, it's a tick box, rah, rah, rah. But they don't necessarily understand, you know, because they're like, well, why wouldn't we just go to the experts? Why wouldn't we just talk to the people who know the best about the topic? GovHack really showed that in 24 hours, you know, a whole bunch of people who basically just fueled on pizza and caffeine managed to create some really outstanding applications. And some of them pulled together data that just made some of the government people in the world wet their pants in terror. But it was great. I mean, one of the examples, I don't think I've actually put them up here because, yeah, my slides are a bit deficient. But one of the examples was, I can't remember the name of it, but they took the register of lobbyists, right?
Lobby
Which is public. Yeah, Lobby Lens, that's the name.
I still get flame mails from lobbyists. They're like,
yeah, good
why are you doing this? Get it off Google. It comes up higher than
it's so great. Yeah. But what they do is they took the register of lobbyists and they matched that against who wins tenders in government. And it presented this visually, right? And you could just see about half of the room, you know, half of the mouths in the room just dropped and just went, oh shit. But this is the thing, like, this is what open data, it gives it a lot of, but it also did things like, there was another tool there called Know Where You Live, where you put in your, actually, I'm online. I have the power of the interwebs. I can do these things. Okay, Know Where You Live was also one of my favorite ones. It was a cute little tool that basically, it'll come up. Okay, it's very slow internet. Okay, I won't bother. So you put in your postcode, and what they did was they aggregated data from crime statistics, from housing property information, from demographics from ABS, from you know, archives, photos, and so you could say, okay, well, I'm going to look at Yass, my hometown. Here's a photo of it 100 years ago. Here's the you know, the ethnic breakdown, the religious breakdown, the white collar, blue collar breakdown. Apparently, the amount of ecstasy went up 200% from 2 people to 4. I live in a very small town.
You're not responsible, are you?
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, but it was really, really funny to watch, to see people sort of comparing the towns. And that pulling together of data demonstrated to a lot of government people in the room that value. Because to actually create that app in government through a typical government procurement tendering process, a year, maybe, you know, and probably several $100,000 and probably blowout, and you know, it's very, very difficult. So it really demonstrated the value to them of opening up data to get new apps, to get new ways to present stuff. There's a really good Gov2 Australia Google Groups mailing list, which I'd highly recommend jumping onto, and there's a bunch of different projects about it, and there's great people involved. So if you're interested in this space, I'd highly recommend getting involved in the community. Oh, I did something bad. Garbage. Okay, so OpenGov. The Senator early spoke about the sort of 3 pillars, and we've sort of looked, I've been trying to follow this space pretty closely over the last 3 years, and the 3 groupings that we came up with really do seem to encapsulate pretty much everything. So open data, citizen-centric services, and public engagement. So I'm just going to go through what they mean in a more practical sense. So open data. I'll go to my notes. Okay, so basically, permissive copyright obviously is really, really important, and there are a lot of examples right now where, you know, the data is up, you want to use it, and I've had so many emails from people saying, oh, this is a really, really great data set, but it says here that I can't, you know, use it for this purpose, you know, and I've tried to make the introduction, and then they've been given like an implicit permission, but at the same time, just change the license. You know, it's ridiculous to make it difficult to use your stuff because of copyright. But in some cases, there is a challenge there. I mean, I am on a bit of a personal quest at the moment, and there's a major culture change that needs to happen here. For instance, I'm on a bit of a personal quest to free the Magna Carta. Now, you know, because I always pick the small targets. So I don't know if any of you know, but up in Parliament House here in Canberra, we've got one of the world's best preserved copies of the 1297, I think, copy of the Magna Carta, and it's one of the world's best preserved, and they've just gone and digitized it, and just done a beautiful job of digitizing it so that they could make a beautiful online interactive version of it. So I asked for a copy of it so that we could create a comment and put it online. And they said no. So therein, we had several months of emails back and forth and all the rest of it. Now, the thing is that this isn't people being nasty. This is actually exactly the opposite. From that person's perspective, this person sees themselves, and they are, a curator for a very, very important piece of work, right? When you say to them, why do you want to stop it being used, their perspective in the back of their mind, the premise they're coming from is we don't want to see people manipulate it. We don't want to see people defame it, write over it. We don't want to see people do the wrong thing by it. So we had this fascinating moment in the conversation where I said, but it's the Magna Carta. And she says, yes, it's the Magna Carta. And I went, oh yeah, right, we have such a different perspective we're coming from. So it's not because they're bad or good. It's just but it is, though, because I'm coming from, it's the Magna Carta, so of course it should be open and free, and surely it's out of copyright. She's coming from, it's the Magna Carta, so I have to protect it, I have to lock it down, I need to make sure that it's not, ruined and all this kind of thing. Sorry? Yeah, those guys have been such...
Imagine what could happen.
Yeah, actually, you don't want to imagine... Oh, my brain's already gone. Why do you do this to me, Andrew?
You could end up with ponies all over it.
Or worse. Anyway, so the point is, though, that there is a major culture change that is starting to shift now. People, and particularly in the cultural institutions, there is starting to be this shift from the understanding that cultural heritage isn't something to be bound up and put up on the shelf. It's actually something to be made available, because the more open you make it, the more opportunities for innovation, for access, for all kinds of great stuff. I'm not even watching the time. What time have I got to speak to?
12 to 10 minutes.
Oh, crap. Okay. Machine readable. I can, and it's scary, but I can.
We have a break after that anyway, so.
Okay, machine readable, time stamp, subscribe. These are all sort of things that you guys know. One of the big things to recognize, though, about open data is how difficult it's going to be to get there. It's an ideal. It's not something that you can just switch. There are, and I'll talk about this now. There are like 3 stages to doing open data. There's the shotgun approach, where you just put stuff online, and we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing that on data.gov.au. We're seeing that on the Open Spatial Data Management website, where they've put like hundreds and hundreds, I think thousands even, of data sets of geospatial stuff. I think data.gov.au now has about 800 or 1,000 data sets, and they've basically just said, put your stuff online. So they've said, okay, well, we've got it in this format. In a lot of cases, particularly now, they're starting to put permissive copyright licenses on it, which is great, and that's a step, but they're just putting it up as it is. So the first stage is just getting it up, and examples, I've already spoken about. Early publishing always goes through this process, and inevitably people like us turn around and say, why on earth did you put a freaking PDF up, you idiots? Now, that's not good, because when a person's walking up the hill towards you and you kick them in the face, they tend to go backwards. So that's first stage. Second stage is strategic. This is where we start to see them putting data up in a more useful format, in a more readable format, in machine readable formats, in automatable formats. Data.gov.au Beta 2 is starting to get there, but it still needs a lot of work, but they're certainly working on a lot of linked data strategies and stuff now as well. Bureau of Meteorology is probably one of the most exciting projects that I've seen, which is in the process of being happening now, where they're going to have an entire... the guy that's the head of their information design actually wrote the standard for linked data and URL linking and such for Europe and for the implementation of the UK government. So I think that what they're going to do is going to be interesting. That'll be all climate data. So lots and lots and lots and lots of climate data suddenly available in useful formats that we can all do really cool stuff with. And I won't go into politics. Living Atlas of Australia, I don't know if any of you guys have seen this, but this is such a fantastic project where they've taken lots and lots and lots of data about, I always get this wrong, flora, and it's searchable, it's linkable, it's a beautiful resource. There's a lot of upcoming emergency collaborations. The budgets are starting to be sort of permissively copyrighted and put out in useful formats. But the emergency collaborations are particularly interesting because you need to be able to mash up lots of different data sets to be able to respond effectively to an emergency. And there's some really good stuff happening around Australia. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to blog this talk and put lots more links and details in for you. But the third step, and this is where we really want to get to, is that collaborative phase, where you start to say, okay, well, we've put up a data set. How do we take inputs from people to actually, and how do we verify them, and how do we use that to actually keep our data sets up to date? That's a really, really big step to take, and it's very difficult. I did have some screenshots. There we go. So there's the Atlas for Living Australia. So some collaborative examples. We're mapping our Anzacs, where they put up all of the service records of people from World War I, and I've got 5 minutes. Powerhouse online collection, and people could then add their own stories, add their photos, all that kind of stuff was really cool. Powerhouse Museum put all their stuff online, and you could actually tag it. So you'd see something like a boombox, and it would just say, musical instrument, and you could say, okay, well, I associate it with the 80s or with, breakdancing or with, and so you could get that contextual stuff added to mapping or Anzacs, Powerhouse Museum. Data visualization is one of those things that, as technical people, we tend to turn around and say, just read the data, what's wrong with you? But data visualization, I have to say, I have actually become a convert, because what I've started to realize is it gives you the capacity to find new information. And it gives you a chance. Does anyone here work in government? Do any of you do policy? Not really. Okay. Oh, a couple of you. One of the things I found is that it gives you the opportunity to load test your policy, so to speak. So you can say, okay, well, maybe, for instance, the language resources available for Chinese-speaking immigrants in this area are X, and you can sort of do that mapping just to that one, piece of information. But if you throw into the degree, for instance, age, and then sort of start to interact with the data, you may be able to see just how relevant the specific services you're providing are. So it gives you that chance to just sort of through the act of interacting with the information to find new knowledge and then to actually test your policy. Now that becomes, of course, any new knowledge you then glean, you then have to make accessible in other ways. You can't just leave it in a purely visual format, otherwise it's not accessible to people who are visually impaired, but it's still a good tool. Very quickly, citizen-centric services. It's about putting the user experience first. What it's going to need is good metadata. It's better for both the citizen and government. Citizens can find what they want better. Government can, put their resources into great online services and still maintain that face-to-face stuff, but better serve people more quickly. There's a lot of work that needs to be done here. I mean, basically, to do serious citizen-centric services, everyone needs to be able to talk to everyone. Everyone needs to share everyone's data. Because if I don't care which level of government, I just want to know what healthcare services are near me. I want to be able to put in my postcode and find out everything, and that means being able to get access to data from everything. And some great community examples as well. Public engagement. Government is, as I said before, starting to realise the value of public engagement, but we're getting into a period now where the idea of actually engaging the public in policy development live, right? I mean, what used to happen and what still happens largely is you launch a consultation, you say, okay, here's where you send your submissions, and you've got till this date. Submissions go into somewhere, and then maybe 6 months or a year later you'll see a paper come out if you're keeping a really close eye on what's going on, and there's not really much correlation. The big thing that's missing, of course, as we are all very aware of intuitively, is the concept of peer review. So what we tried to do in our office with the consultation methodology we developed, which is, basically it's exactly what we do in free software world. We made it so that everything was put online publicly, and then everyone could comment on each other's. And then the best ideas, you'd have a meritocracy of ideas, effectively, where the good stuff would actually float up, and you'd have context around. And it's not just about the analysis of the ideas, it's also about analysis of the networks of people. If 80% of the response to that idea was negative, but 100% of those people work for that company,
Yep.
You've got a really good piece of context as to how representative that is, of the whole population. So we're kind of leading the way in that, because a lot of people are looking at sentiment analysis and theme analysis and blah, blah, blah. But I haven't seen anyone actually else in government around the world actually that's been looking at that community network analysis. So we're sort of doing a bit of work around that and having a bit of fun with that actually. I had a brief flirtation with computer forensics in a previous life, so it's been fun to put those skills to use again. So some really good examples. So what we've done is a good example. Queensland Police are probably one of the best examples, though. And just to quickly give you an idea of it, it's not just about them being able to put out updates very rapidly that people were subscribing to. Their updates were being read on radio all around the country. It was a very quick and rapid way to get information out to a very large population, not just their Facebook followers, but lots and lots of people, because it was being followed by news and all the rest of it. The really interesting thing was how, for instance, the Courier Mail, and I won't comment on how good they are, I don't know, but they would come out with a story and say, the police have killed a puppy or whatever, and Queensland Police would take a screenshot of this story on the website, will put it onto their Facebook under the tag Mythbusters, and then say, here's the actual truth. Now, inevitably...
Police and truth in one word to me just was oxymoron, but anyway.
See, but this is the interesting thing about government. Nothing's that black and white. Nothing. Really, I mean, anyway, the point is that they were able to deal with misinformation, particularly during a period of floods and cyclones when misinformation can actually be really disastrous for people. So, and I've never seen a government department or agency, let alone anyone else really, effectively deal with misinformation before it had a chance to run around the world. And so the story would be pulled from Courier Mail within an hour or two. The Courier Mail would have one or two people on there saying stupid pigs. The Facebook page would have 10 or 20,000 comments of people saying stupid courier mail, and and it really changed. It changed significantly a lot of people in government's perspectives about the fact they can talk directly to people, you know. And finally, crowdsourcing data. They would actually have people putting on the Facebook, oh, we've just seen a bridge go down, there's a couple of people trapped on a car. They could actually deploy their resources more effectively, and because the police, the Queensland Police Department, in the case of a disaster, is the lead agency on dealing with a disaster, so it gave them a very, very effective capacity to do that. Okay, very quickly, the last couple of things. I've always said you're only as free as the tools you use. I've maintained that sentiment for many years now, and it sort of helps, I think, helps people understand that, you know, you can choose to use this piece of software which limits you in a particular way, but just be aware of the choice. Open source is a natural fit for open government with, you know, standards, with, there's a lot of great tools. We're just seeing a lot of people around the world in a lot of the stuff that they're doing, whether it be open data, or whether it be hackfests, or whether it be blogs or public engagement, really using a lot of open source stuff, which is really great. I think this is a space that is taking off of its own account, is built on the back of the principles and premises that we already have, and so our community and our technologies end up being a really, really good fit for this kind of stuff. Whenever people ask our office, you know, how we do some of the stuff that we've been doing, none of which is particularly hard, by the way, I always just tell them, go and find yourself a good open source community person, and they will just be able to do this stuff intuitively. It's worth just throwing in, a lot of people say we just need everything to be open in government. Of course, when you think about it for like more than 2 seconds, you realize that's impossible. I mean, you don't want all of your Medicare records publicly available, obviously. So there is personal, like, privacy and security sort of areas where open data is probably not the best way to go. Having said that, that's a very small proportion of data, so we should still be going for a large proportion. The other thing is that there's a lot of unintended consequences you don't necessarily think about. I heard about a case study quite recently where a data set which was the mapping of the oceans above Australia was made available publicly, right? Within, I think it was a month or 6 weeks, a particular species of fish had been fished to extinction, because basically one of the companies that does the fishing picked up the data and went, whoops, awesome, we know what's there, and went up and used that data and basically, you know, created a major fauna issue for that species. So there are sometimes unintended consequences. It's not an excuse to not do it, but it is worth realizing that it's not the glorified show pony that a lot of people think it is. Okay, very quickly, there's a lot of great stuff that's been happening with open source in government, and I know that there's a talk by by Brian from the GMO a bit later that should go into a lot of stuff, but I just wanted to briefly mention that there is an open source software policy. There's 3 principles. I really want to highlight the third one. Australian government agencies will actively participate in open source software communities and contribute back where appropriate. How great is that? We've been aiming for that for years, have we not? It's very exciting. And the second version of the open source guide came out in July as well, after lots and lots of months of consultation, and great people from our community like Mike Carden and Steve Schmidt and such were involved in that as well, so that was really, really good to see. It's a bit of a technical, I'm out of time, so I'm going to just say thanks. I hope that gives you just a bit of an idea about there is actually a practical thing happening here. It's not just kind of fluffy airspace, but do you have any questions? Yes?
What kind of...
Oh, no, I have one last thing to say. Sorry, it's very important, very important. Open government is an ideal, right? It's something to aim towards. Considering we are right now at a open source developers conference, you all exactly know what it means, the difference between reality and an ideal. It's really important because whenever people say to me, oh, well, what about this policy? That obviously isn't open government, so therefore this is all just talk. It's like, no, government isn't like a single animal on a lead that I'm running, or that any single person is running. It is a very, very, very complex thing, and there are going to be lots of policies that will support or conflict or all over the place. The point is it's an ideal. The point is that the ideal has been committed to by the government, and whenever government commits to something, that becomes something to anchor them to and to hold them to, and that's a really good thing. We are in a really good position at the moment to actually push for more openness, more transparency, and the best way to do that is constructively. So it doesn't have to necessarily be positive and shiny all the time, but please try and be constructive. It really helps. Sorry.
Actually, half answers my question.
Oh, good.
Because my question
what about the filter policy?
Those policies are great, but what are the processes to get adherence to that? As you know, obviously, we have to get people to actually
Yeah.
apply those policies, and we're not there yet.
So the procurement policy is mandatory, and that's mandatory as of earlier this year, and so that's being pushed pretty hard, and people have to comply. Obviously, there are still cases where people don't; they just go and do their own thing, but they do get a bit of a rap on the knuckles for that kind of thing. But you should ask the GMO guy about procurement stuff. When it comes to other parts of the policy, often enough, just sometimes subtly, sometimes not subtly, pointing out how someone is not in compliance is a useful thing. You always start with subtle, just as a tip. But because there is that political will and we basically got two documents: the Gov2O Task Force report and the Ahead of the Game. I can't remember what it's called. I had something of the administration. It was the Moran report, but it was called Ahead of the Game, Building a Future for the Public Administration, or something like that. But those two reports, basically between them, actually define the blueprint for what's happening. So, and one's being implemented by AGMO, and one's being implemented by the APSC, which is the Australia Public Service Commissioner. So that, there's a lot of changes that need to happen at a lot of levels, but, we're getting there. It's just a matter of continuing to push forward and making sure you're not stepping backwards too much. Other questions?
Really quick question.
Yes.
I don't know, because I've been wanting to chat to you about it for a while, but when I've been doing a lot of stuff with the open gov data, I really came at it from a perspective of wanting to link up Indigenous information.
Yeah, cool.
And I found that the Indigenous information that I got in the open gov data set was hardly there and not really there.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Do you know of any initiative that's been done around that area, particularly for Indigenous information? Or?
Weirdly, I do, but through a completely different project. I was actually involved in I actually ran a major national consultation about digital culture, basically to contribute to the national cultural policy to make sure that digital voices and industries and arts and stuff are represented. And there's a bunch of cool stuff that's happening there around Indigenous culture and digitalisation of it and that kind of stuff. But actually, what I would suggest is if there's any data sets you're after, Data.gov.au has you can actually request for data sets there. So that might be a way to go through it as well and actually work through them, because they sort of are an agency that should be able to track down that kind of stuff, or at least know who to ask. But I'll keep an eye out though, and I'll let you know if I come across anything. Anyone else? Because otherwise I've gone over time. Yo! Can't hear you.
Information and to capture agents, etc. So it might actually be open source and may actually be other projects, and we just sort of connect them to the open source.
Okay. Well, it's actually interesting. I went on a project years ago where I went up to set up some computers in Nhulunbuy and up in the Arnhem Land. And sorry, this is a very, very quick example of why we need to get word about what we do out. A community there had basically had a university, which will remain unnamed, develop a fantastic solution. They basically had like a little handheld device that was mostly driven by locally relevant language and icons, but spoken, because there was a bit of problem with reading and writing, literacy and such, and so, but it gave the local community a way to be able to track issues in the community and manage them locally before the police had to get involved. But because then they had the data, then they could track it, they could identify trends, they could identify particular cases that they would have to work on, and it really gave them a far greater capacity to manage and provide resources to deal with the issues in the community that they were dealing with. Now, they went back to the university and said, look, this has been great in this community, can we take it to that community over there, who's a desert community, so an entirely different sort of culture, language, everything. So we're talking a database switch, right? Icons and vocal snippets. And they said, oh, that'll be $40,000 because all the IP was retained with the university. And I just said to them, look, if you've got funding to pay for something, why wouldn't you, as part of the terms of contract, make sure that you retain the intellectual property? Now, there is some really interesting stuff in some of the recent guidelines about intellectual property for Australian government, where it says that they want it to be basically openly available if possible. But there is also the option for the company to retain the IP. Now, this can work both ways, of course. That could work really well because it could give the opportunity for the company to then open source it and do all kinds of stuff, and that's happened in some cases. But having that flexibility to actually, well, in the first case, to actually think about the IP rather than just having it done and then being caught up in that kind of situation is really important. But secondly, then having a flexible structure where you have a number of choices available to you, so you can choose the best one for what you're trying to achieve is quite good. But yeah, I hope that helps a little. All right, I think we all need to eat, yeah? Okay, thank you very much.